Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, and tonight we will be talking about the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Before we begin, I wonder where in the world are you listening from? Perhaps you're in a quiet apartment in Moscow, or maybe a countryside home in Canada, or halfway across the globe where the night has already settled in. Wherever you are, settle in, let your mind drift, and let the story carry you through a century of ambition, triumph, and collapse. Imagine a world where winter stretches on endlessly, where the snow glitters under pale sunlight, and the horizon seems to go on forever. This was Russia in the final years of its empire, a land so vast it contained 1,000 landscapes and 1,000 different lives. In the grand halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, chandeliers sparkled above marble floors, and the royal family dined on delicacies from every corner of the empire. Yet far away, in small wooden cottages buried in snow, peasants wrapped themselves in rough wool, tending to the same frozen soil their families had worked for generations. It was a land of beauty and contrast, of splendor and hardship, bound together under the rule of one man, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs. Nicholas was a man born into a destiny he never chose, crowned in an age when monarchs still held immense power, yet lived under the constant pressure of a changing world. His empire was immense, spanning from the forests of Poland to the mountains of Central Asia, from the icy ports of the Arctic to the warm shores of the Black Sea. But despite its size and history, the Russia of the early 20th century was not an unshakable giant. Beneath the gold and ceremony of the royal court, there were murmurs, grumblings from those who had begun to question why so few held so much, while so many had so little. The peasants made up the overwhelming majority of the population. They toiled in the fields with tools that had barely changed in centuries, often working from dawn until the last light of day faded. Hunger was a constant companion, and in years when the harvest failed, famine spread like a shadow. In the cities, the Industrial Revolution had arrived late, but with brutal force. Factories roared with clanging machinery, and the air filled with smoke that turned the snow black. Workers labored long hours for little pay, living in crowded, dimly lit tenements where illness could spread overnight. The Tsar's court seemed a world apart from this reality. The royal family lived surrounded by luxury, their lives carefully shielded from the struggles of the common people. Lavish balls, glittering uniforms, and elegant banquets painted a picture of timeless power. But outside those palace walls, the tide of history was beginning to swell. Political ideas from Western Europe seeped into Russia, ideas of democracy, socialism, and revolution. Students debated them in secret gatherings, workers passed them around in banned pamphlets, and exiled radicals plotted the future from far-off cities. The early years of Nicholas's reign were marked by war and unrest. In 1904, the empire stumbled into a disastrous conflict with Japan. The defeat was humiliating, shaking the faith of the people in their ruler. The following year, a peaceful protest in St. Petersburg turned into tragedy when troops opened fire on unarmed civilians, a day remembered as Bloody Sunday. It was a wound that never fully healed, and it planted seeds of mistrust that would grow for years to come. Even in the vast silence of Russia's endless countryside, the winds of change could be felt. A strange, tense quiet had settled over the land, like the moment before a storm. The Tsar and his ministers tried to maintain control, granting small reforms here, tightening restrictions there, but the empire was too vast and its problems too deep to be smoothed over with half measures. In the glittering palaces, the court continued its rituals, unwilling to believe that the ground beneath them was slowly shifting. The Russian people had lived for centuries under the autocracy of the Tsars, believing that the monarch ruled by divine right. But by the dawn of the 20th century, that faith was eroding. Each strike, each protest, each whisper of new ideas chipped away at the old order. Nicholas clung to the belief that his family's rule was unshakable, yet the truth was far more fragile. The empire was like a frozen river in spring solid on the surface, but beneath, currents of discontent were beginning to rush faster and stronger, wearing away the ice. far away from the palaces and the ministries, in crowded factories, in dim taverns, and in candlelit rooms where men and women spoke in hushed voices, a new Russia was being imagined. It was not yet clear what shape it would take, but its birth would be painful, and its arrival would change the world forever. The last days of the Tsars had begun, though almost no one could yet see how close the end truly was. And in the quiet of winter nights, under the vast Russian sky, history was quietly preparing to turn the page. The year 1917 began in the depths of winter, with snow piled high along the streets of Petrograd, the city once known as St. Petersburg. Food was scarce, the war with Germany dragged on with no end in sight, and the Russian people were growing desperate. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and the cold gnawed at the bones of those waiting for a ration that might not come. Factories struggled to keep running. Men were sent to the front in endless waves, and the women and children left behind faced long days of work and hunger. Whispers of unrest spread through the city like frost creeping across a window pane, and each week seemed to bring more strikes, more protests, more frustration, with a government that appeared both distant and indifferent. On the streets, tension simmered. Workers left their factories in defiance, demanding not just better pay, but peace and an end to the war that had already claimed so many lives. Soldiers, exhausted and poorly supplied, began to waver in their loyalty. The once unquestioned command of the Tsar was now met with doubt. When the protests swelled in February, they began as marches and rallies, thousands chanting in the cold air, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the city. But what began as protest quickly escalated. Troops were ordered to fire on the crowds, yet many soldiers hesitated. Some disobeyed outright, lowering their rifles or even joining the demonstrators. It was a moment that signaled the old order's grip was slipping. In a matter of days, Petrograd transformed into a city in revolt. Barricades appeared along the streets, and the sound of marching boots mixed with the chants of protest. The Duma, Russia's parliament, called for change, but the Tsar, isolated at his military headquarters and far from the capital, clung to the belief that his authority could still hold. He sent orders to restore control, but by the time they reached the city, the situation had spiraled beyond command. The imperial government was collapsing in real time, not through a single decisive battle, but through a flood of defiance that spread faster than it could be stopped. By early March, Nicholas II made a fateful decision, abdicated the throne. For the first time in more than 3 centuries, Russia was without a Tsar. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled through war, plague, famine, and countless uprisings, was gone in an instant. In its place, a provisional government was formed, made up of politicians and reformers who promised freedom, democracy, and an end to the chaos. Many hoped this would be the beginning of a new chapter for Russia, one of stability and peace. But the provisional government faced an impossible challenge, ending the war without losing face, feeding a starving nation, and uniting a population divided by ideology. Meanwhile, another force was rising in the shadows, the Petrograd Soviet, a council made up of workers, soldiers, and radical thinkers, was growing in influence. Their ideas were sharper, their demands more urgent, and their patience for half measures almost non-existent. Among them were men who had spent years in exile, watching and waiting for their moment to act. One of them was Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, who returned to Russia in April, like a spark landing in dry grass. His message was simple yet electrifying: peace, land, and bread. End the war immediately. Give the land to the peasants. Feed the hungry. The months that followed were turbulent. Power was split between the provisional government and the Soviet, a situation known as dual power that could not last. The summer brought mass demonstrations, mutinies among the troops, and street clashes between rival factions. Trust in the provisional government eroded as it failed to deliver on its promises, and the Bolsheviks, once a minority, began to gain ground. Their speeches and newspapers reached soldiers in the trenches, peasants in the villages, and workers in the cities, promising a revolution that would not simply replace one government with another, but dismantle the old order entirely. By the time autumn arrived, the city was restless, its people weary of compromise. In October, under the cover of night and with careful coordination, the Bolsheviks moved to seize power. They took control of key bridges, railway stations, and government buildings, meeting little resistance. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, fell in a matter of hours. The leaders were arrested, and Lenin declared that the Soviets now held power in the name of the workers and peasants. Russia had undergone 2 revolutions in a single year own that ended the monarchy, and another that swept aside the fragile attempt at democracy. The Bolsheviks promised that the storm was over, that the dawn of a new society had arrived, but in truth, the country stood on the edge of an even darker and more chaotic chapter. The Revolution of October had not united Russia, had split it in ways that would soon ignite into a brutal struggle for the nation's very soul. When the Bolsheviks seized power, in October 1917, their grip on Russia was far from secure. What they held was not a peaceful, united nation, but a vast and fractured land where loyalties were divided and old wounds had yet to heal. The revolution had toppled the provisional government, but it had also unleashed a torrent of resistance. Monarchists who still dreamed of restoring the Tsar, Republicans who wanted democracy, foreign powers eager to crush the new regime, and nationalists seeking independence for their regions all began to gather their forces. It was the birth of a conflict that would come to be known as the Russian Civil War, a struggle so fierce and far-reaching that it would determine the fate of the nation for generations to come. The 2 main sides soon emerged. On one were the Reds, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, fighting to solidify their revolution and build a socialist state. On the other were the Whites, an uneasy coalition of monarchists, liberals, former imperial officers, and anyone opposed to Bolshevik rule. But unlike the neat divisions of a traditional war, the Russian Civil War was chaotic and sprawling. Between the Reds and the Whites stood countless smaller forces, anarchist militias, peasant uprisings, nationalist armies in Ukraine and the Baltic, and foreign troops sent by Britain, France, Japan, and the United States to protect their interests and, if possible, overthrow the new Soviet regime. The geography of the conflict alone made it staggering. The front lines stretched across thousands of miles of frozen tundra, dense forests, wide steppes, and endless rivers. Armies were scattered and often cut off from supplies, forced to march for weeks through snow and mud to reach the next battle. Railways became lifelines, carrying troops, weapons, and grain across the vast distances, and armored trains bristling with cannons and machine guns hunted along the tracks like moving fortresses. Villages caught between rival forces often changed hands multiple times, with each side leaving its mark in the form of burned homes, confiscated food, and weary survivors. For the ordinary people of Russia, the civil war was a nightmare without end. Peasants were pressured to give their grain to whichever army passed through, and refusal could mean brutal punishment. In some regions, famine took hold, and whole families perished in the silence of empty cottages. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded camps of refugees and prisoners. The war was not just fought on battlefields, it seeped into every home, every field, every life, until no part of the country was untouched by its violence. The Bolsheviks understood that survival required discipline and unity. Under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, the Red Army was transformed from a ragged collection of revolutionary militias into a disciplined fighting force. Trotsky traveled the country in his armored train, rallying troops, enforcing strict discipline, and ensuring that the Reds could match their enemies in both numbers and organization. They also had a key advantage. They controlled the heartland of Russia, including the major cities of Petrograd and Moscow, as well as the industrial and railway hubs that kept their war effort alive. The Whites, by contrast, were scattered on the peripheries, their armies separated by vast distances, often unable to coordinate effectively. The fighting raged for years, moving like a Tydione month, favoring the Whites as they advanced deep into Bolshevik territory, the next pushing them back as the Red Army regained lost ground. In the south, General Denikin and later General Wrangel led white forces from the Don and Kuban regions. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak declared himself the supreme ruler of Russia, commanding his own white army. In the northwest, General Yudenich made a desperate push toward Petrograd. Each of these offensives threatened to crush the Bolsheviks, yet one by one they faltered, worn down by harsh winters, poor supply lines, and the relentless counterattacks of the Reds. The Bolsheviks also fought the war on a political front, using propaganda to rally support and demonize their enemies. Posters, newspapers, and speeches painted the whites as puppets of foreign powers, willing to sell Russia to its old imperial rivals. The Reds promised land to the peasants, factories to the workers, and self-determination to oppressed nationalities, promises that were not always kept, but which proved powerful in winning loyalty. The whites, divided by ideology and mistrust, failed to offer a clear vision for Russia's future, and many ordinary people saw them as a return to the old order they had just overthrown. By 1920, the momentum had shifted decisively. The white armies were in retreat, their leaders fleeing into exile. Wrangel evacuated the last major white stronghold in Crimea, leading tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians onto ships bound for foreign ports. Kolchak was captured and executed. Across the former empire, Bolshevik forces consolidated control, crushing remaining pockets of resistance. The victory was not total guerrilla warfare, and local uprisings continued for years, but the outcome was clear: the Bolsheviks had won. The cost, however, was staggering. The civil war had claimed millions of lives, not only through battle, but through famine, disease, and repression. Whole regions lay in ruins, their fields untended, their towns emptied. The Red victory also came with a hard truth. To survive, the Bolsheviks had relied on ruthless measures executions, censorship, forced requisitions that would become hallmarks of the Soviet state. Out of the chaos of revolution and war, a new order had emerged, forged in blood and steel, ready to begin the great experiment of building a socialist nation. But the peace that followed was not gentle. It was the silence of exhaustion, of a land that had given all it had to the struggle, and now stood at the threshold of an uncertain future. The dreams of revolution still burned brightly in the speeches of its leaders, but beneath them lay the scars of a war that had nearly torn Russia apart. The Soviet Union was about to be born, but its cradle was filled with the echoes of gunfire and the weight of all that had been lost. By the winter of 1922, after years of revolution and civil war, the shape of a new nation began to emerge from the wreckage of the old empire. The Bolsheviks, now firmly in control, understood that what they had created was not merely the continuation of Russia under a different banner, but something entirely unprecedented. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was declared in December of that year, uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation under one federal government. It was a name both ambitious and symbolic, meant to suggest equality between its parts, though in truth Moscow held the reins tightly. The red flag, adorned with the hammer and sickle, became the emblem of this new world, and its leaders spoke in terms not of centuries-old tradition, but of a bold, ideological future where the working class would rule and the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. For the millions of people living within its borders, the birth of the Soviet Union was not a moment of sudden transformation, but the continuation of daily survival. Cities still bore the scars of war, factories lay silent, railways were in disrepair, and shortages of food and fuel were common. In the countryside, peasants tried to recover from years of forced requisitioning and fighting, planting what they could in fields that had been neglected during the chaos. The new economic policy, introduced by Lenin, allowed a degree of small-scale private trade, easing some of the tension between the government and the peasantry, and in the markets of Moscow and Petrograd, stalls slowly began to fill with goods once again. But this was only a temporary compromise, a step back meant to give the new state time to breathe before it pursued its more radical visions. In the minds of its architects, The Soviet Union was more than just a political arrangement. It was the first step toward a worldwide revolution. Leaders in Moscow believed they were laying the foundation for a society that would inspire workers across the globe to overthrow capitalism. The Kremlin became both the seat of government and a symbol of defiance against the old order of monarchies and empires. Delegations from other countries arrived, some curious, others wary, to see what this new socialist state was building. At the same time, the West watched with suspicion, and the Soviet Union found itself surrounded by governments that were hostile or uncertain, making the dream of global revolution far more distant than its leaders had hoped. The organization of the new state reflected the ideals of its founders. In theory, each republic had the right to leave the Union, though in practice, this right existed only on paper. Local languages and cultures were recognized in official rhetoric, but Moscow controlled the economy, foreign policy, and the armed forces. The Communist Party was the backbone of the state, its influence extending into every factory, school, and military unit. Membership in the party became a pathway to opportunity, but it also required strict loyalty to its principles and its leaders. The transformation from the old Russian Empire to the Soviet Union was also a transformation of identity. The Tsarist state had been built on hierarchy, religion, and loyalty to the crown. The Soviet Union replaced those with a new narrative: class struggle, atheism, and devotion to the collective. Church bells that had once marked the hours fell silent as religion was pushed aside in favor of Marxist-Leninist ideology. Portraits of saints were replaced by portraits of Lenin, whose face became as familiar in every town as the old imperial coat of arms had once been. The revolution's heroes were celebrated in speeches and songs, and history was rewritten to frame the Bolsheviks as the inevitable saviors of the working class. Yet, beneath the slogans and celebrations, the country remained fragile. The Civil War had left deep divisions, and not all who lived under the Soviet flag embraced the new order. In remote provinces, resistance still flickered small uprisings, bandit raids, and nationalist movements seeking independence. The government responded with force, sending the Red Army to put down dissent wherever it arose. The memory of war had taught the Bolsheviks that unity had to be enforced, and they were willing to use whatever means necessary to maintain control. In the cities, life began to take on a different rhythm. Workers were organized into state-run factories, students attended schools where they learned the new history, and cultural life was infused with revolutionary themes. Artists, writers, and filmmakers were encouraged to create works that glorified the worker and the socialist future. The streets were decorated with banners urging productivity and loyalty, and May Day parades filled the boulevards with red flags and marching bands. It was a society in the midst of constructing not just new institutions, but a new way of thinking, one in which the collective was always placed above the individual. For those who believed in the revolution, these years were filled with hope, a sense of participating in something historic and transformative. For others, there was unease, a feeling that the promises of freedom and equality were being replaced by a different kind of control. But in 1922, and the years immediately after, the Soviet Union still carried the energy of its creazione, conviction that it was not merely rebuilding from the ashes, but building a new world altogether. The future was unwritten, and in the minds of its leaders, it was theirs to shape. Whether that future would bring prosperity or tragedy was a question that no one, not even the architects of the state themselves, could yet answer. When Lenin died in January 1924, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The revolution was still young, its foundations not yet hardened, and the question of who would guide it forward became one of immense consequence. Among the leaders of the Communist Party, alliances shifted like shadows, each figure seeking to position themselves as the natural heir to Lenin's legacy. In public, the leaders spoke of unity and collective leadership, but behind closed doors, rivalries sharpened. Out of this struggle emerged one man who seemed, at first, an unassuming figure: Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the party. His role was seen by many as bureaucratic, administrative, not the seat of true power. Yet Stalin understood something his rivals did not. Control over the party's machinery was control over the future itself. Slowly, methodically, he built networks of loyalty, placed allies in key positions, and ensured that his influence reached every corner of the Soviet system. As Stalin consolidated his authority, he began to shape the Soviet Union according to his vision that demanded rapid transformation from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. The new economic policy, which had allowed limited private trade under Lenin, was dismantled. In its place came a series of ambitious 5-year plans, each designed to expand heavy industry, modernize infrastructure, and prepare the nation to stand against any threat from abroad. Factories rose from the ground in cities that had once been little more than market towns, and the hum of machinery began to echo across the land. Steel, coal, and oil production surged, as did the construction of dams, railways, and vast industrial complexes. The pace was relentless, and the targets set by the state were staggering, pushing both workers and managers to their limits. But industrialization alone was not enough for Stalin's vision. He believed that the countryside, too, had to be transformed, its small, scattered farms replaced by large, collective operations under state control. This policy of collectivization aimed to feed the growing cities and generate grain for export, but it met fierce resistance from peasants who saw their land, livestock, and tools taken from them. Many slaughtered their animals rather than surrender them. Others hid grain from government requisition teams. The state responded with force. Those labeled kulaks, or wealthy peasants, were arrested, deported, or executed. Entire villages were uprooted, their populations sent to remote labor camps. In Ukraine and other grain-producing regions, the disruption of farming, combined with harsh requisition quotas, led to a devastating famine in the early 1930s, claiming millions of lives. While the countryside suffered, the cities became showcases for the regime's achievements. New apartment blocks rose alongside factories, and public works projects promised to bring electricity, clean water, and education to millions who had never known them. Propaganda celebrated the worker as a hero, their efforts framed as building the future of socialism. Children learned in school to revere the state and its leaders, to see themselves as part of a grand historical mission. Science, art, and literature were all harnessed to serve the cause, producing works that glorified industry, collective labor, and the unbreakable will of the Soviet people. Yet behind the banners and parades, a darker reality took shape. Stalin's rule became increasingly defined by fear and suspicion. He saw threats everywhere within the party, the military, even among his closest associates. In the mid to late 1930s, this fear crystallized into the Great Purge, a campaign of political repression that swept through the Soviet Union like a shadow. Party members, generals, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens alike could find themselves accused of sabotage, espionage, or treason. Trials were staged, confessions often extracted under torture, and the sentences were swift execution or long years in the labor camps of the Gulag. The purges decimated the Red Army's officer corps and hollowed out the party's leadership, leaving only those utterly loyal to Stalin. Life under Stalin was a contradiction of extremes. On one hand, the nation was undeniably transforming. Illiteracy was being eradicated. Women were entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the Soviet Union was becoming a global industrial power capable of rivaling older, wealthier nations. On the other hand, freedom of speech was virtually non-existent, personal expression was stifled, and the fear of arrest lingered in every conversation. The achievements of the era came at a cost measured in human suffering, a cost that was quietly buried beneath the triumphant slogans of progress. Stalin's cult of personality grew ever larger, his image omnipresent in posters, statues, and portraits that hung in homes, schools, and factories. He was portrayed as the wise father of the nation, the tireless architect of socialism, the man who had brought the Soviet Union from the brink of chaos to the threshold of greatness. For many, genuine admiration mixed with fear-praise for Stalin was not merely expected, it was necessary. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had been remade in Stalin's image. It was powerful, disciplined, and industrially advanced, yet it was also a place where trust was scarce and dissent could be fatal. The people had endured rapid change at a staggering pace, their lives shaped by both the promise of a new future and the heavy hand of the state. And as the nation looked toward the coming decade, few could have imagined that it would soon be tested not just by internal challenges, but by the greatest external threat it had ever faced, a war that would push the Soviet Union to the edge of destruction and transform it yet again. The summer of 1941 began like any other, with the Soviet Union focused on its industrial growth and the continued consolidation of Stalin's power, but the illusion of stability was shattered on June 22, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Without a formal declaration of war, German forces poured across the western borders, 3 massive army groups advancing deep into Soviet territory with breathtaking speed. Bombers struck airfields before dawn, tanks rolled through the countryside, and entire divisions of the Red Army found themselves surrounded before they even understood the scale of the attack. Stalin, who had been warned repeatedly by intelligence services about the possibility of a German invasion, was momentarily paralyzed by the shock. For days, chaos reigned as Soviet commanders struggled to organize defenses against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The initial months were catastrophic. Whole cities fell in rapid succession. Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, among them, millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. In Ukraine and Belarus, the countryside burned as German forces pushed eastward, seizing farmland, railways, and industrial centers. Civilians faced a nightmare of occupation, with Nazi policies bringing mass executions, deportations, and the systematic targeting of Jews and other groups deemed undesirable by the regime. The Soviet Union's western lands became scenes of unimaginable suffering, where entire villages could be wiped from the map in a single day. Yet, in the face of disaster, the Soviet people began to rally. Stalin addressed the nation, calling on citizens to defend their motherland in what he now declared a great patriotic war. Factories in the West were dismantled piece by piece, their machines loaded onto trains and shipped thousands of miles east to the Urals and Siberia, far from the reach of German bombers. Workers labored around the clock to reassemble them, producing tanks, planes, and weapons in quantities that would eventually outstrip the German war machine. Every able-bodied man was called to the front, and women stepped into roles once reserved for men, driving trucks, working assembly lines, and even flying combat missions. The war effort became a national endeavor, consuming every ounce of the country's strength. By the winter of 1941, the German advance reached the outskirts of Moscow. Snow blanketed the land, and temperatures plunged far below freezing, but the capital did not fall. Soviet forces, reinforced by troops from Siberia, who were well prepared for winter warfare, launched a counter-offensive that pushed the Germans back from the city. It was the first major defeat for Hitler's army in the war, and it showed that the Soviet Union, though bloodied, would not collapse. The war's most brutal chapter came in 1942 at Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River whose name carried symbolic weight. The Germans sought to capture it both for strategic reasons and for the blow it would deal to Soviet morale. The battle that followed was a hellish contest, fought street by street, building by building, often room by room. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, living in cellars and ruins, while the city above them burned. Soviet defenders clung to every inch of ground, refusing to surrender even as their numbers dwindled. In November, a massive Soviet counteroffensive encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting them off from supplies. Trapped in the freezing ruins, the German forces faced starvation and disease before finally surrendering in February 1943. The victory at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war. It was the moment when the tide began to shift in favor of the Soviet Union. From that point forward, the Red Army went on the offensive. The battles of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, and the relentless push westward drove the Germans back across the lands they had conquered. Soviet soldiers liberated one devastated city after another, uncovering the horrors of Nazi occupation, the mass graves, the empty villages, the skeletal survivors of concentration camps. The war had become not only a fight for survival but a crusade to avenge the suffering inflicted on the Soviet people. Life on the home front remained grueling. Food was rationed, fuel was scarce, and families often went years without seeing their loved ones at the front. Letters became lifelines, carrying words of hope between soldiers and those waiting for them. Entire communities adopted the mantra that every sacrifice was for victory. Children collected scrap metal, elderly farmers worked the fields, and artists painted stirring images of resistance and triumph. Propaganda posters declared, "Everything for the front, everything for victory," and this was no empty slogan, it was the reality of daily life. In the spring of 1945, after years of unrelenting warfare, the Red Army entered Berlin. The capital of Nazi Germany lay in ruins, and in May, the war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union had emerged as one of the victors, its flag raised over the Reichstag as a symbol of triumph. But the cost of victory was almost beyond comprehension. Over 20 million Soviet citizens were dead, cities lay in rubble, and vast swaths of the country had been devastated. Every family had lost someone, and the wounds, both physical and emotional, would take generations to heal. The Great Patriotic War had forged a new sense of identity within the Soviet Union, a belief in resilience and sacrifice. It had also elevated the nation to the status of a superpower, its influence stretching across Eastern Europe as the Red Army remained in the territories it had liberated. Yet, even as victory parades filled the streets, a new tension was already brewing. The alliance with the United States and Britain had been one of necessity, not trust, and with the war over, the world was about to split into opposing camps once again. The Soviet Union had survived its greatest trial, but it was stepping directly into the shadow of another kind of conflict tone that would be fought not with armies on battlefields, but with ideology, influence, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The guns of World War II had barely fallen silent when the uneasy alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers began to fray. During the war, they had stood side by side against a common enemy, but beneath the handshakes and joint declarations there had always been a deep mistrust. The Soviet leadership saw the capitalist West as inherently hostile, a threat to the survival of socialism, while in Washington and London, many believed that the spread of communism was as dangerous as fascism had been. With Nazi Germany defeated, the glue that had bound them together dissolved, and what emerged was not open warfare, but a different kind of struggle waged in boardrooms, laboratories, and distant battlefields, where opposing sides rarely met face to face. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union moved quickly to secure the territories its armies had liberated. Communist governments, loyal to Moscow, took power in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, creating a buffer zone between the USSR and the West. To the Soviet leadership, this was essential for security. Russia had been invaded 3 times in less than 50 years, and Stalin was determined that no enemy would march on Moscow again. But in the West, these moves were seen as aggression, the spread of an authoritarian ideology under the guise of liberation. Winston Churchill famously described it as an iron curtain descending across the continent, separating the Soviet sphere from the capitalist democracies of the West. The United States responded with policies designed to contain Soviet influence wherever it appeared. Economic aid flowed into Western Europe through the Marshall Plan, helping nations rebuild and reducing the appeal of communist movements. In turn, the Soviet Union tightened its grip on its own bloc, forming the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance to bind its allies together economically. The world was slowly dividing into 2 camps, each with its own vision for the future, and each convinced that the other posed a mortal threat. This new era of tension became known as the Cold War conflict, without a formal declaration, yet fought with relentless intensity. One of its first great crises came in 1948, when Stalin ordered the blockade of West Berlin, cutting off all rail, road, and canal access to the city in an attempt to force the Western Allies to abandon it. Instead, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in food, coal, and supplies for nearly a year until the blockade was lifted. The episode demonstrated that both sides were willing to push the boundaries of confrontation without tipping into direct war, but it also hardened the division of Germany into East and West, a symbol of the larger global divide. The Cold War was as much a battle of ideas as of territory. The Soviet Union promoted itself as the champion of the working class, the leader of a global struggle against imperialism and capitalist exploitation. The United States portrayed itself as the defender of freedom and democracy, even as both sides engaged in espionage, propaganda, and covert interventions around the world. The competition extended into science and technology, most dramatically in the race to conquer space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, stunning the world and proving its capabilities in rocketry. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, his smiling face celebrated across the globe as a triumph of socialism. The United States responded with its own achievements, culminating in the Apollo moon landing in 1969. But space was only one arena, the arms race was another, and it cast a shadow over the entire planet. Both sides developed nuclear weapons of unimaginable destructive power, stockpiling them in numbers that could obliterate civilization many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant that a full-scale war would be suicidal for both, yet the possibility of catastrophe was never far from people's minds. Schoolchildren in America practiced duck and cover drills, while Soviet citizens were told to be ready for Western aggression at any moment. The fear seeped into culture, politics, and daily life, shaping an entire generation's understanding of the world. The Cold War also played out in conflicts far from Europe. In Korea, the division between the Soviet-backed North and the American-backed South erupted into war in 1950, ending in a tense stalemate that still exists today. In Vietnam, Cuba, Africa, and the Middle East, both powers supported rival factions, turning local struggles into proxy wars, in which the weapons and advisors of the superpowers clashed indirectly. Every revolution, every civil war, became another contest in the global struggle between two systems. Inside the Soviet Union, the post-war years brought both pride and hardship. The victory over Nazi Germany and the new status as a superpower inspired a sense of national strength, yet resources were strained by the demands of rebuilding and maintaining military parity with the West. Stalin's death in 1953 brought a period of cautious reform under Nikita Khrushchev, who denounced some of Stalin's excesses and spoke of peaceful coexistence with the West. But even this thaw was limited, and crises like the Cuban Missile Standoff in 1962 showed how quickly the Cold War could bring the world to the brink of disaster. By the 1960s, the division between East and West had become an accepted part of the global order, a constant background to everyday life. Borders were fortified, alliances solidified NATO in the West, the Warsaw Pact in the East, and the ideological struggle seeped into every sphere, from literature and art to sports and culture. The Cold War was not just a contest of power, but of identity, a question of which system would define the future. And while the guns were mostly silent between the superpowers themselves, the world remained a place of tension, where a single miscalculation could plunge humanity into a war from which there would be no return. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union stood at the height of its global power. The red flag flew over an empire that stretched from the heart of Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and its influence reached into Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It had stunned the world with the launch of Sputnik and the triumph of Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight, proving that socialism could not only match the technological feats of the West, but sometimes surpass them. In the eyes of many around the world, the Soviet Union was a model of rapid industrial growth and scientific achievement, a nation that had risen from the ashes of war to challenge the oldest and wealthiest powers on Earth. Its leaders walked confidently on the world stage, and its military strength was unquestioned. Yet beneath the surface of this seeming stability and progress, problems were slowly growing problems that were harder to see from the outside, but which in time would threaten the foundations of the entire system. The Soviet economy, once fueled by the furious drive of the post-war years, began to show signs of strain. Central planning had achieved remarkable feats in rebuilding the country and expanding industry, but it was also rigid and slow to adapt. Targets were set in 5-year increments, production quotas dictated from Moscow, and innovation often stifled by bureaucracy. In factories and collective farms, meeting the plan became more important than improving quality or efficiency. Reports were padded, numbers adjusted, and shortcomings hidden to avoid punishment. This culture of meeting quotas at all costs created mountains of goods that were poorly made, stockpiled without use, or broken before they could be repaired. The arms race with the West added another burden. Maintaining military parity with the United States required vast resources, money, labor, and raw materials that could have gone into improving consumer goods or housing were instead funneled into tanks, missiles, and submarines. While Soviet citizens took pride in their nation's military strength, many also endured long lines for basic necessities. Stores could run out of meat, butter, or even shoes for weeks at a time. The state provided housing, healthcare, and education, but the quality varied greatly, and urban apartment blocks built quickly to house a growing population often crumbled within decades. Politically, the country was stable on the surface, but the memory of Stalin's purges had left a deep caution in public life. People knew what could happen to those who spoke too openly, and so most learned to keep their thoughts private. Even as the fear of mass terror lessened under later leaders, like Leonid Brezhnev, the system encouraged conformity and discouraged dissent. Art, literature, and film were expected to serve the ideals of the state, portraying the Soviet way of life as heroic and inevitable. Works that strayed from this path were censored, and their creators risked harassment, exile, or worse. Still, there were moments of genuine optimism. The Soviet Union made strides in science, medicine, and education. Literacy was nearly universal. Universities trained engineers and scientists in numbers unmatched anywhere else, and space exploration remained a source of national pride. New cities were built in remote regions, bringing electricity, railways, and modern industry to areas that had been untouched for centuries. Sports victories on the international stage, from Olympic gold medals to dominance in chess, were celebrated as proof of the nation's superiority. To many inside and outside the USSR, it seemed that the socialist experiment was not only surviving, but thriving. Yet there was also a quiet sense that the pace of change was slowing. In the early years of the revolution, life had been marked by upheaval, for better or worse sweeping reforms, massive construction, bold leaps forward. By the 1970s, the system had settled into something more static. Brezhnev's era became known for its stability, but also for its stagnation. Leaders in the Kremlin preferred to maintain the status quo rather than risk the instability that might come with sweeping reforms. This caution kept the country from sudden collapse, but it also allowed inefficiencies and corruption to grow unchecked. In private kitchens and quiet conversations, some began to question whether the promise of socialism was being fulfilled. People remembered the sacrifices their parents and grandparents had made in the name of building a better future, and they looked around to see shortages, long waits for housing, and a government that seemed more interested in projecting power abroad than solving problems at home. Others simply adapted, finding ways to work around the system trading favors, relying on personal connections, and seeking goods through the black market. Internationally, the Soviet Union projected an image of unshakable strength. It supported revolutionary movements abroad, maintained a powerful military presence in Eastern Europe, and competed fiercely with the United States in every sphere from sports to diplomacy. But these efforts came at a cost. The war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, drained resources, cost thousands of lives, and slowly eroded public confidence in the leadership's judgment. What had been presented as a quick mission to support an allied government turned into a drawn-out and unpopular conflict, eerily reminiscent of America's troubles in Vietnam. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Soviet Union was still a superpower, still feared and respected, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it once appeared to be. The cracks were not yet wide enough to bring the system down, but they were growing. The machinery of the state still turned, but it did so with more friction, more waste, and less purpose. And while most citizens carried on with their lives working, studying, raising families, there was a quiet, unspoken sense that the country was drifting, that the energy and ambition of earlier decades had given way to something slower, heavier, and harder to move. The Soviet Union was still standing tall, but the ground beneath it was beginning, in subtle and almost invisible ways, to shift. When Mikhail Gorbachev rose to the position of General Secretary in 1985, the Soviet Union was a superpower in name, but a tired giant in reality. The years of stagnation under Brezhnev, the costly misadventure in Afghanistan, and a system weighed down by inefficiency had left the country struggling to keep pace with a rapidly changing world. Gorbachev was younger than his predecessors, energetic, and spoke openly about the need for renewal. He promised not a rejection of socialism, but its revitalization, breathing life back into a system that had, for too long, relied on the momentum of the past. His reforms, known by two key words, perestroika for restructuring and glasnost for openness, were meant to repair the Soviet Union from within. But in the process, they would shake its foundations more than anyone could have foreseen. Perestroika was aimed at overhauling the economy, loosening the grip of central planning, and allowing a limited return of market-like mechanisms. Factories and farms were given more control over their own operations, and some small-scale private businesses were permitted for the first time in decades. The hope was that this would encourage efficiency and innovation, but decades of working under rigid orders from Moscow had left managers and workers unaccustomed to decision-making. Supply chains that had been built for a command economy often failed to adapt, and the partial reforms created confusion rather than stability. Shelves that had once been predictably, if sparsely, stocked became increasingly empty, and lines for basic goods grew longer. Glasnost was, in many ways, even more transformative. It opened space for public discussion and criticism, allowing newspapers to print stories about corruption, mismanagement, and even long-hidden truths about Soviet history. Citizens learned details about Stalin's purges, the scale of the famine in Ukraine, and the government's failures in events like the war in Afghanistan. Writers, filmmakers, and artists began producing works that pushed boundaries, reflecting on past injustices and present shortcomings. For some, this was liberatinga, long-awaited breath of fresh air after decades of silence. But for others, it was deeply unsettling, shaking their faith in the system they had been taught to trust. As these reforms unfolded, the unintended consequences began to spread. Glasnost encouraged not only criticism of the government, but also open expressions of nationalism in the Soviet republics. In the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, calls for greater autonomy grew louder, accompanied by mass demonstrations and symbolic acts like raising national flags that had been banned for decades. In Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, and elsewhere, similar movements emerged, fueled by the sense that if the Soviet Union was truly becoming more democratic, then its republics should have the right to shape their own destinies. What had once been a tightly bound union began to feel more like a collection of restless regions, each with its own ambitions. The challenges were not only internal. Abroad, the Cold War was entering a new phase. Gorbachev sought to ease tensions with the West, meeting with U.S. President Ronald Reagan in a series of summits that led to arms reduction agreements and a thaw in relations. The world watched as the Soviet leader spoke of peace, cooperation, and a common future beyond ideological rivalry. But while these diplomatic successes improved the USSR's image internationally, they also meant that resources once dedicated to the military were being diverted or, at least, not expanded in the same way, further revealing the country's economic weaknesses. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the winds of change were blowing faster than anyone expected. The Soviet Union had long maintained its sphere of influence there through a combination of political pressure and the presence of Soviet troops. But Gorbachev made it clear that he would not use force to keep these nations in line. Without the threat of Soviet intervention, governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and elsewhere faced growing public demands for reform. In 1989, one by one, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to fall, most dramatically with the opening of the Berlin Wall. To the outside world, it was a moment of triumph for freedom. To many inside the Soviet Union, it was a sign that the old order was crumbling at an accelerating pace. The late 1980s became a period of dizzying change. Political reforms allowed multiple candidates to run for office, and debates in the newly empowered Congress of People's Deputies were televised for all to see. These debates were often fierce, exposing deep divisions within the leadership and bringing into the open issues that had long been buried. Strikes and protests became more common as workers demanded better pay, improved conditions, and an end to shortages. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986, initially concealed but later revealed in detail under glasnost, became a symbol of the dangers of secrecy and the failures of the system to protect its people. By the dawn of the 1990s, the Soviet Union was no longer the same country it had been just a few years earlier. The press was freer than it had been at any point in its history. Political life was more open, and many citizens were speaking out in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation before. But the economy was in deep trouble, living standards were falling, and the unity of the Union itself was under strain. Gorbachev had set out to reform the system to save it. Instead, his reforms had unleashed forces that no one or not even he could fully control. The Soviet Union was moving rapidly toward a decisive moment, and the question was no longer whether it could be reformed, but whether it could survive at all. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union was a nation on the brink of unraveling. The reforms of perestroika and glasnost had opened doors that could never be closed again, unleashing waves of political, economic, and social forces that overwhelmed the old structures. In cities and villages alike, people grappled with shortages of basic goods, soaring prices, and uncertainty about what the future held. The economy was in freefall. Factories that had once been the pride of Soviet industry stood idle or operated at a fraction of capacity, and unemployment, a concept previously foreign to the system, began to spread. The familiar rhythms of life-steady jobs, guaranteed housing, and state-provided services were breaking down, leaving millions adrift in a sea of change. At the heart of the crisis was a growing sense of disillusionment. For decades, citizens had been told that the Soviet Union was a great and unstoppable force, the defender of the working class and the beacon of progress. Now, they faced a reality of lines at stores, black markets, and political chaos. The Communist Party, once the unquestioned center of power, was losing its grip, and rival political groups and nationalist movements gained strength. Across the 15 republics that made up the Union, voices calling for independence grew louder and more insistent. Many argued that the Soviet experiment had failed and that their peoples should chart their own paths. The Baltic republics Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were among the first to break away, declaring independence in 1990 and 1991, defying Moscow's attempts to maintain control. In Ukraine, the world's second-largest republic, the call for sovereignty became a powerful force, culminating in a referendum where the vast majority voted for independence. Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, and others followed suit, each republic seeking to reclaim its identity and freedom after decades under Soviet rule. The very idea of the Union was slipping through the fingers of its leaders. Within Moscow, tensions rose to a breaking point. Gorbachev struggled to hold the country together, proposing new treaties to reform the Union into a looser federation. But these efforts came too late and met fierce resistance from hardliners who feared losing their power. In August 1991, a group of conservative communists launched a coup attempt, seizing control of key government buildings and demanding the rollback of reforms. But the people, tired of authoritarianism and inspired by the calls for freedom, rose in defense of democracy. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, stood defiantly atop a tank outside the Russian parliament, rallying crowds against the coup. The failure of the coup marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. In the months that followed, the Union's authority crumbled. The Republic signed agreements recognizing their independence, and on December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest outside Minsk to declare the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, effectively dissolving the Soviet Union. 3 days later, Gorbachev resigned as president, acknowledging the reality that the country he had led no longer existed. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was both a moment of liberation and of loss. For many, it was a triumph, the end of an oppressive regime, the birth of new nations free to govern themselves and embrace democracy and market economies. But for others, it was a time of uncertainty, hardship, and nostalgia for a world that had vanished. The transition was chaotic, marked by economic collapse, political instability, and sometimes violent conflict, as newly independent states struggled to find their footing. Old alliances were broken, families separated by new borders, and the future felt fragile and unknown. Yet the story of the Soviet Union did not end with its fall. Its legacy lived on in the architecture of its cities, the memories of its people, and the geopolitical realities that continued to shape the world. The rise and fall of this vast empire was a saga of dreams and nightmares, of hope and terror, a century-long journey that had reshaped not only a nation, but the entire globe. As the quiet of history settled over the decades that followed, the echoes of the Soviet Union whispered in the wind, reminders of a time when the world seemed poised on the edge of transformation, and a vast experiment in human society rose and fell like a great, restless tide. Now, as you drift into sleep, imagine that tide slowly receding, leaving behind stories carved in stone and memory, a vast landscape where history sleeps beneath a sky full of stars. The Soviet Union has passed into the quiet of the past, but its story remains waiting patiently for those who listen in the stillness of the night.